Hello and welcome to the program. I am Suren. Many people, as you know, pride themselves upon the fact that their opinions are the results of their independent judgment and are not dictated or influenced by those they habitually associate with or by what they read. 9 out of 10 are probably deluding themselves when they make such an assertion. The aim of education, we are often told, is to train people to think for themselves. We appreciate this attitude of mind behind such a statement, but it is also very dangerous. Why is that so? Thinking for oneself is extremely commendable if one is equipped to do so. But if one is not, then it is better to consider other ways before it leads one to strange situations. We're a type of person who, despite all the geographers and scientists, is convinced that Earth is flat. Or the person who is seemingly sure that Napoleon Bonaparte never existed, or that the first chapters of the book of Genesis are literally true. We can easily say that he has thought all these things out for himself alone. But if there are others likely to believe differently, that would be their choice. However, he prefers to rely upon his own judgment and common sense rather than accept the opinions of another person. In regard to anybody holding views of this nature or adopting this attitude, we can easily call a crank. This is a term which comes from the German adjective meaning crooked or ill. Such an attitude betrays a diseased mentality or crooked methods of thinking. Perhaps there is something of the crank kind in all of humanity. Intelligent people would probably commit errors of judgment quite so flagrant as those instances we made mention of before. They would be typical of the kind of the world thing. All human beings are prone to it at times. In other words, there are issues in which it would be impossible for us to think for ourselves. That could be considered absurd for the mere layman to put his own uninformed opinions against that of someone like Einstein or Eddington in the considerations of science. If you are a gardener, but an amateur one, and wanting to know the best method of treating problems with some of your plants, you would do well to accept the advice of a qualified horticulturalist or somebody experienced well in gardening. A sensible person, when ill, would certainly not prescribe medicine for himself. He would choose to go to a doctor and accept his professional opinion, knowledge that diagnosis and treatment of one and who made a special study of medicine is more likely to be correct. In other words, a sound judgment can only be created by one who is in possession of all the relevant information and experience. And in some cases, such knowledge can only be possessed by the expert. Therefore, for normal thinking people, it is important to defer this opinion. There is a problem when they set themselves up as experts and accepted as such, when they know little, if any, more about the subject upon which they pronounce than does the ordinary intelligent layman or the professional. There are such doctors and fortune tellers and those who set themselves up as professionals, religious leaders, or even scholars. There are also many almanacs, more popular, of course, in our grandparents' days than they are now, who prepare to tell the major world events years ahead. Perhaps there are two species to impose upon many of us in our days. However, do not let us suppose that they are masquerading as the expert is no longer amongst us. But then, again, he may be more active than ever. The only difference is that he or she employs him more subtle means, especially when utilizing the social media, so that he or she cannot be so readily detected. And therefore, we must be on our guard against such when they set themselves up as a dictator on moral issues and keeper of his neighbor's conscience, just like the Nazi regime in 1940s in Europe, or even the cults like Jehovah's Witnesses. We may declare that we should go to the expert for facts and the real truth, and possibly for an expression of opinion on the significance of those so-called truths. But that moral issues are a matter for the individual. He or she may speak of his or her problems with friends in order that he or she may see them from as many points of view as possible. At the end, it is he or she who must make up his or her mind. So, we need to amend the definition of the aim of such education and say that it is not to teach us to think for ourselves, but to teach us to distinguish between when it is legitimate to think for ourselves and when we may accept the judgment of others. On what conditions we need to accept the judgment of another in preference to our own, would you say? 1. When the issue with which we are concerned is outside our own competence, where specialized knowledge is involved, have been quoted before. I wish to engage a servant or a business assistant. I know nothing about his character or ability, so I apply to his previous employer. I wish to go to overseas by the cheapest possible way, so I consult a travel agency or a friend who has recently made the trip and can give me the information I need. 2. The person must be a recognized authority on his or her subject, or we must be convinced of his or her competence to express an opinion which is better informed than our own. Where a professional person is concerned, his training, status, and academic qualifications, experience, reputation will influence in making up our minds on this point. More personal matters, such as the best course to adopt in a position of difficulty or to achieve some desired result, we should be influenced in accepting or not accepting the advice of a friend by the extent to which we felt we could rely upon his or her wisdom or her ability to pull the strings for us. If we were happy that he or she fully understood the position, that and previous occasions he or she had given advice, either to us or to others, which showed the soundness of his or her judgment, and that probably with a wider experience of the world. He or she was capable of taking a more balanced view than we ourselves were. Then we should be justified in accepting his or her opinion, provided it also complied with the points we will talk about sometime soon. But the opinion of the expert is only valid within his own field. If we desire to excel at a certain sporting activity, we would be doing better to listen to what a champion of that field has to say. And an established novelist would give us useful hints on how to write the bestseller. They are, of course, entitled to express their views on gold standard or the colonial question. But whatever they express on the subject cannot be taken as authority unless it can be shown that they have qualifications to write upon these subjects as well as on that sporting issue, or best-selling authors. It happens occasionally. A well-known writer may be an authority on finance and banking, but this would be an exception rather than the rule. 3. We need to be certain that our authority is not biased. Perhaps where the subject is a scientific one, and sometimes impossible when it is religious, political, economic, historical, or sociological. For instance, we may quote the conflicting statements of the truth about the Spanish Civil War or the Nazi Germany. It's interesting to read about Roman Catholics constantly accusing English historians and misinterpreting the Reformation by writing it up purely from the Protestant point of view. It is not always easy to know whether a so-called authority is biased or not, but it does happen before the statement is impartial and passionate, when in reality it is not so. Bias creeps into works of scholarship. It is more often than not of this unconscious kind. Supposes, does a responsible author deliberately set out to misrepresent or to mislead, but it must frequently happen that his or her political or religious convictions, his or her judgments, without him or her realizing it. What is the professional to do? Question mark. Is there any reason for supposing his or her authority is likely to be biased, and he or she should be very chary of accepting his or her word, just as he or she would hesitate in a personal matter to accept the advice of friend if he or she thought that friend had an axe to grind. In other cases, it might be beneficial to consult a number of authorities, especially the points on which they disagree. These will most likely be the controversial points where bias is most likely to creep in, and on which the absence of any definite and conclusive evidence must keep an open mind. And then a word on the untestified authority. No trust or credence can be placed in such statement as, doctors say, a well-known engineer declares, etc. We cannot accept the tests and, above all, do these anonymous testimonies, and in many cases they are probably fictitious and invented for advertising. Thereby, equally to be distrusted, advertising slogans such as beer is best, eat more bread, go to McDonald's, or buy only. There are many examples that you can read in the libraries or in the social media. There are advertisers and propagandists wishing the public to arrive at a certain conclusion, but expressing in such a manner as to induce them to accept the conclusion without going through the various stages of the argument. They may sound quite correct, but as we are concerned, we may have accepted them without arriving, then by a reasoning process of thinking, and we cannot consider them as opinions either, unless they are examined and tested in the light of all available and irrelevant evidence, satisfying ourselves that they rest upon qualified expert opinion. We must regard them with some amount of skepticism. However, it may be subjected to objections and is not the acceptance of qualified expert opinion. Modification of the principle previously enunciated that reason is, for every individual, the ultimate court of appeal. On the surface, it may seem that way, but in reality it is not. We can only accept another judgment or opinion then our reason tells us that is more competent than we are on this particular subject. In accepting it, we believe that he or she has arrived at it by means of his or her reason, and that, given the same experience, qualifications, and knowledge, we should have arrived at the same conclusion. So, the principle of rationality is not violated. Cause and effect. That is the subject of intrigue. Remember, we are living in a rational universe, in a universe grounded in laws which are eternal and immutable in their operation, therefore can be relied upon. By repeated experiment and by the use of man's own reason and intelligence upon the results of his experiments, has been able to discover many of these laws, but many more still remain undiscovered. Once the fact has been established as true, it remains true for all the time. When we say that it is true, we really mean that it is in accord with the rationality of the universe. When there were such stability behind the scheme of things, there could be no universe and no life, only chaos. It is factual that we frequently have to modify our beliefs and so-called laws, especially in the realm of the natural sciences. Which does not mean that we had not discovered the truth, that certain facts had not been taken into account, and that now, with evidence at our disposal, we can get a little nearer to the truth than we were before, I should say. Therefore, it is not the law that we are modifying, but our statement of it, which we have discovered to be incomplete and imperfect. It is true that we may hold contradictory beliefs. At times, we do not even realize that the contradiction exists. At others, we are well aware of it, but are perfectly content that it should be so. Have been known people who were well versed in the findings of modern science, and yet hold religious beliefs which, as scientists, would never accept for a moment. It is very similar to this scenario. When I enter my oratory, said one of these men, I forget my laboratory. Such people would have divided the universe into compartments, having no relation to one another, and each being governed by different regulations and laws. For intelligent or thinking people, such a position is clearly untenable, and it has always surprised the thinking people that it should be found, particularly in connection with religion. Religion surely presupposes the unity of all phenomena in God, which is not compatible with the existence of two different orders in the same universe. All truths are about different facets of the truth, its universal aspect. Hence, in the very nature of things, two truths cannot conflict. If some of our beliefs appear contradictory, then we have very good reason for suspecting that all of them are not sound or well-founded, and we should re-examine their standpoint without prejudice. Nor it is either intelligent or honest to assume that our beliefs in any particular scientific, religious, or economic must be sound and in accord with the truth or reality, and that whatever conflicts with them must therefore be erroneous. In examining beliefs which are apparently contradictory, we must approach our task with an open mind. One of the most important of the universal laws that man has discovered is the law of cause and effect. If we do things, then certain other things will follow. Given those certain conditions, we may be sure of a certain outcome. For instance, if we lower the temperature of water to, say, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it will freeze, given the necessary data. We can calculate exactly how much heat a balloon, for instance, will stand before it does burst, and what is the maximum size it will reach before it gives way under the strain. So convinced are we of the validity, rationality, and constancy of this law of cause and effect, that if the expected reaction does not occur, we conclude that a new factor, which we were unaware, has entered in if the water does not freeze, when the thermometer registers 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Then there is something wrong with the thermometer, or the water has impurities in it. Or there has been a change. The air pressure or something else is the matter. We can indeed think of all kinds of reasons for the unexpected results, but we cannot suppose that nature has arbitrarily changed her law. This knowledge of the law of cause and effect has enabled us to become masters of our environment in a way in which primitive man never was. It indeed assisted us to think ahead, so to speak, and to cooperate with the forces of nature instead of blindly working in ignorance of them. The true sequence in the material and physical sphere, where what we call the forces of nature operate, but that is because so far the greater part of our research has been directed to explore that particular side, to the exclusion of everything else. There is most certainly evidence that the same sequence exists in the realms of mind and of morality, and that this should be so, we must needs believe if we hold that the universe is one and indivisible, and that material, the intellectual, and moral are but different manifestations of one reality. Everything we have spoken so far have a very definite relation to the question of clear thinking. And much of the human reasoning is linked up with it. To connect cause with effect, or, as we often call upon to do, to trace effects back to their causes, lies obviously within this sphere of the intellect. However, though our law is a perfectly rational one, and our thoughts or applications of it to specific is also rational, our conclusions are likely to be false. All sorts of them are concerned with facts, and facts fall into two classes. 1, perceived facts. 2, inferred facts. To arrive at the inferred fact, the mind must be exercised on the perceived facts. A driver sees that one of his tires is flat. that is a perceived fact. From that, he infers the tire has been probably punctured. That is an inferred fact. And there is a good probability of it being correct. But it may not be. There are other possible explanations. And if these are overlooked, there is a possibility of the inference being the wrong one. If this case, they cannot be wrong about the perceived fact, but we cannot be certain about the inferred fact until every relevant consideration is taken into account. One, the tire may have been punctured. 2, the valve may be defective so that the air has escaped. 3, it may have been deliberately deflated by someone. 4, the tire may only recently have been fitted and not inflated. These explanations have been considered and rejected. Then, the first issue of them being punctured is, in all probability, the correct one. But it is still only an inferred fact. If the driver examined the tire and actually finds a puncture in it, then the inferred one becomes an observed fact. Now consider yet another example. As you know, there is a proverb which says, "Where there is smoke, there is fire." If we take it in a little sense, the existence of smoke is the observed fact, but the experience leads us to infer the existence of fire to produce the smoke. As with the previous ones, we are taking the effect and considering it back to get at the cause. It is the same process as that to which a doctor has resource or recourse when he deduces the nature of an illness by the study of symptoms. The law of cause and effect plays an important part in our thinking, and because of this, it is all the more imperative that we need to be on our guard against unsound or irrational application of it. There are 3 tendencies we should avoid. 1, the assumption that because one thing follows another, it must therefore be the result of it. But there is an absurdity of supposition of this. Obviously, it may be truly amazing how often people do tend to think and argue this way. My Jehovah's Witness wife was exactly the same. So I am very familiar with this example. Imagine a child going to the school, and a few days afterwards, it is discovered that he has developed measles. Once the parents would connect the two, though actually there may be no connection at all, and how often we hear the shortcomings of the younger generation, attributed variously to the after effects of the troublesome day or whatever else, including the social media, cinema, school activities, and a host of other issues. They may account for the shortcomings, questioning, but it may be dangerous to assume that as they do, then construct an argument on that basis. This is what the Jehovah's Witnesses have done with me after listening to assumed characteristics of me while treating me like a criminal of not accepting their truth. 2. Tendency to read a logical and rational interpretation into what is merely coincidence. Imagine a fortune teller tells a lady that she will inherit a large sum of money. Some months later, someone does actually die and leave her money, whereupon she concludes that the fortune teller actually could see the future. But she may have forgotten all the other things that the fortune teller promised her, which have not materialized. If she could inquire of others to whom the same promise of money had been made, she would probably find that they were still waiting for its fulfillment. Therefore, the success of this prophecy and the case in question proves nothing beyond the fact that the fortune teller happened to strike lucky. With this prophecy, is there to be some coincidence which, by the credulous mind, will be regarded as the fulfillment? It is not short of the belief in winning a huge amount of money by playing lotto. Those who prophesy can create real trouble, even intentional pain. The same type of credulity, reading a rational interpretation into a more or minor coincidence, can be found also in that well-known state as scaring, so frequently indulged by the Puritan forefathers that we are familiar with when they had an important decision to make. They customarily took their Bible, opened it at random, and the first text by which was caught by their eyes that seemed to bear on their problem was taken as divine counsel regarding the course they should pursue, and the assumption there was apparently that their attention upon that particular text was by no means a matter of pure luck or accident, but that they had been directed to it by some providence. And it was quite rational to follow its advice. I believe it was the same as the beginnings of the cult of Jehovah. How did they explain those occasions when the assumed advice proved sound and was a question to answer? But so far, no one among them was able to do so. 3. There is a tendency to generalize from one incident, which may be a fluke. It is an extension in a different direction of the subject we have spoken. A cause and effect law can admit of no exceptions and can only be established when we made sure, as far as possible, that it holds good for old cases to which it may legitimately be applied. But any attempts made sometimes to establish such a law on the basis of a single case and an opinion is expressed which rests upon no sound foundation than isolated piece of evidence. A student preparing for an examination weigh his time. His teachers prophesy that he will fail. Yet when the results of the exams are published, it is discovered that he has passed all of them. How we justified and drawing from this conclusions? Let's examine. 1. That one need not work to pass the examinations. 2. That since they have passed a student who has not worked, the examiners are incompetent. 3. That the judgment of the teachers cannot be relied upon. Interesting questions. Indeed, no such generalizations can be made perfectly well. Inquiry over a large number of cases would probably show that the generality of students do find it necessary to work in order to pass an examination, and that to majority of those who do not work do not succeed. An inquiry would probably also reveal that in most cases, the judgments of the teachers were justified. Those certainly effect that they occasionally misjudged would show that they are not infallible. However, it is quite a different issue from the question of the general reliability of their judgments. Should our inquiries reveal that a large number of unpromising students had passed, while a large number of competent ones had failed, then we should have good reason for suspecting that there was something wrong with the system of examination. But no generalization can be made one way or another of a single case. This may seem obvious when it is pointed out, yet people do often argue in this illogical way. We have heard so many times, "Oh, my daughter was one of the best in her school, yet she has not gained the scholarship." That just shows that the examination does not pick out the best candidates. Sometimes certain officers have been found guilty of accepting bribes. Believe it or not. You may hear sentences like, "Oh, I always said the police force was corrupt." During the Great War, there appeared in the newspapers a story of a soldier whose life had been saved by a Bible, which he carried in his pocket. And the suggestion was, though it was not stated, that there was some particular virtue in its being a Bible, which had protected him in this way. And no doubt many simple folk believed that the book had acted as a kind of a talisman. If they would have reflected a little further, they might have realized that, provided it was the same thickness and in the same pocket, a pocket dictionary or a pack of playing cards would have been just as effective, and that many other soldiers had found his Bible afforded that many another little protection against bullets when he carried it in his knapsack instead of his pocket? In case like this, the will to believe is a very potent factor. A person who is strongly anti-communist or anti-fascist or anti-democracy is ready to believe anything. And if the prominent members of the party is proved guilty of embezzlement or of any other criminal conduct, he inclines to associate such conduct with every other member. But should anyone stigmatize his own party in the same way? Just think about it. Not related with the tendency is what is known as special pleading, i.e., laying down a general rule for others, but pleading and assuming special exception to it in one's own case. A person who lives on dividends drawn from investments left to him by his father objects to receiving the unemployment payments on the grounds that it is demoralizing to a man to draw money for which he does not work. To a person who makes this statement, there are three logical positions. 1. He may maintain his contention, renounces dividends, and work for his livelihood. 2. He may recount his statement or concede that the unemployed has as much right to money for which he does not work for himself. 3. He may show that the two cases are not comparable, since different factors and circumstances are involved. Any of these 3 points would be rational and logical, but if he follows none of these, then we can only conclude that he means it is degrading for others, but not for himself, to receive money they have not worked for. In this case, he is guilty of special pleading, a very common cause of distorted thinking. Only recently, I have been told that the person speaking to me was complaining that they were paying very high taxes for the government to pay the old age pensioners their pension. What a low and distorted thinking it was, which can only come from the mouth of an idiot, as the old saying goes, brainless. There is, of course, the instance of the Englishman who describes Frenchmen, Germans, and Italians contemptuously as foreigners, but is mortally offended when it is pointed out to him that in any other country but his own, he also would be a foreigner. And before we condemn certain songs of other countries for what seems to us being their intensely nationalistic spirit, we might do well to ask ourselves, what impression would we make on a visitor from abroad by hearing the English assembly lustily singing "Land of Hope and Glory" by the logician? Often they fall back upon the plea of common sense. One might say, I know it is not logical, but it is common sense, thereby implying a kind of opposition between logic and common sense. This idea has become firmly rooted in the popular minds, especially of today. Nothing could be further from the truth. Could anything that was illogical be common sense? ? Just as is, this invention of mind violence breaks every rule of science and mathematics. But it is bound to work, for it is just common sense. Logic is simply the counterpart in the realm of thought of the system of rationality and order which science shows as it exists on the material or physical side of the universe. The common sense as employed is only too often a synonym for what suits me. If we consider for a moment, we shall now realize that a number of occurrences cannot be traced back to a single cause. The other outcome of the combination of an accumulation of causes. The American Civil War or the French Revolution, the times of Mussolini, were none of them due to one factor alone. The purposes of simplification, we may summarize all the various causes under a single heading, such as the operation of the peasantry, nobility, the desire of the southern states to the Union on the question of slavery, the swing of Italy's ambitions after the war by her own allies. And such simplification may have its uses. However, if we are really to understand these occurrences, we must not be content with generalizations of this kind. We need to seek to arrive at all the causes and see how they worked together to produce the results that they did. By the indications of past history, we are usually ready to do this and recognize the validity of the principle. But we are not always so ready in the case of contemporary events, partly, no doubt, because it is not so easy to arrive at the fact, even if we desire to, and partly because of a certain partisanship or bias which inclines to point at what was facing the facts, which might disturb our preconceived ideas. There must be confused causes with pretexts or ultimates with immediate causes. The last straw was the immediate cause. The ultimate cause was the overloading of the camel, which resulted from the combined weight of all the strokes. Addition of a very small extra weight merely precipitated the tragedy. In the same way, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand at Sarajevo was only the immediate, not the actual cause of the Great War. And the outbreak of the peasants' revolt at 1381 can no more better explained by Wat Tyler, Murder of a Tax Collector. If you find it, read it. Then can the English Reformation by the desire of Henry VIII to divorce his wife. We need to look beyond the immediate causes or pretexts to ultimate causes. There is also a motive or psychological cause which has to be taken into account. Philosophers tell us that there are 3 stages to every action: the thought, the willingness, and the doing. Imagine a student steals a piece of fruit from a greengrocer's barrow. First of all, he has seen that fruit and the idea of taking it into his head. Then he makes up his mind that he will act on this thought, and finally he does act on it. It may all occur in the space of a few seconds. But the 3 stages are there just as if the boy or the student had spent hours over it. His action is the result of certain psychological processes which prompt him to exercise willpower in a certain direction rather than any other, because we have come to recognize this. We are also coming to realize that the habitual criminal is what we call a psychological case. In fact, pointed out by Samuel Butler in Erewhon more than half a century ago. And the progressive reform aims at curing criminal tendencies by removing, as far as possible, their psychological causes. Many questions which we are called upon to deal with this psychological factor is an important one. A person is found dead. It may be true enough, up to a point, to say that the cause of his death was poison by his wife. But what prompted her to administer the poison? Was it jealousy? Was it a brainstorm? Was it fear of him? Was it a desire for revenge? Was it done out of compassion because she knew he was suffering from some painful and incurable disease? All these questions are relevant to the case, and similar psychological considerations have to be taken into an account in explaining social, political, historical, or economic developments. Any explanation which omits them is likely to be only partially correct, at the best. Thank you for watching. We will meet again at the same place, same time, here, by the next episode. In the meantime, as always, I say, keep smiling and be happy. Again, thank you.